Awesome. So I'm joined by Andres today. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me here, Ethan.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm super excited to dive into some of your work and been interested in the stuff that you've been putting out for quite some years. And yeah, for anyone that doesn't know, Andres is running Qualia Research Institute and Qualia Computing, a blog about exploring the state space of consciousness. And so yeah, I would love to hear a little intro from you of kind of what is Qualia Research Institute, and like what is it that you're actually doing with this organization, and also a little bit about yourself.
Oh, fantastic. Yes. So I guess about myself, um, yeah, I define myself as somebody who's hyper philosophical. I mean, meaning like it just, David Pierce talks about it as having like philosophical temperament, which is just by nature, I'm, constantly thinking about the, you know, the deep truths about reality. What can we know? What can we do? And that is pretty impairing when it comes to holding a normal job. So I decided to just go for it and see if I could, yeah, turn it into a career. Which, I mean, it's obviously very challenging, but so far so good. Um, what we do at Qualia Research Institute. So like one way in which I kind of like summarize in a very concise way the breadth of research that we do is there's three disciplines that we engage with, and then there's like three goals that we, to which we apply those disciplines. So first of all, we have a philosophy of mind, so like straight up writing essays for, philosophy journals about things like um, how is it possible that a bunch of 100 billion neurons can simultaneously contribute to a unified experience, or like what kind of systems are conscious, what kind of systems are likely to experience pleasure and pain. So yeah, philosophy of mind. Then the second one is neuroscience. So like analyzing neuroimaging data sets and trying to predict things about, like, let's say what state of mind you're in based on, okay, like how does how do your brain waves look like. And then the third one is neurotechnology, essentially developing, yeah, various kinds of interventions in order to influence your state of consciousness, or like enhance meditative progress in a, gentle, subtle, but hopefully consistent way. And then the three goals that we have is reduce extreme suffering. Kind of like we think that the broad category of extremely unpleasant experiences is neglected, tractable, significant, and we think that there really aren't that many organizations that are coming up with kind of innovative ways of tackling intense suffering and how to quantify it and prevent it. The second category is how do we increase baseline, like on a day-to-day basis, how do you feel better, get more stuff done, have healthy relationships and things like that. And then the third category is achieving new heights, essentially investigating the ultra blissful states of consciousness, the super pleasant, and how do we make sense of that, and what is the nature of that, and how can we maybe, figure out a way to incorporate very pleasurable experiences as part of everyday life in a way that is not disruptive, in a way that is not antisocial, and in a way that, yeah, enhances the meaning of human existence. Um, that I would also say kind of like an important overarching aesthetic that we have is that we analyze consciousness a lot from the point of view of the texture of experience as opposed to the aboutness of the experience. I mean, we also care about the aboutness, but we think that there's a lot of low-hanging fruit when it comes to characterizing an experience in terms of, yeah, low-level structural features, like in what way, what kind of flicker frequencies you have, what kind of like symmetries or topologies are expressed in your field of experience. In contrast to, let's say, the emphasis on focusing on semantic content is like, hey, what is the experience about? What is the purpose of it, or what kind of like role is it accomplishing? And along those lines, we have this very strong aesthetic that we call the think tank approach, where we make the claim that there's two overarching paradigms for how consciousness has been analyzed to date. we have on the one hand like kind of the individual explorer paradigm, where you have very, whether it's in meditation or psychedelic research, you have like individual researchers who have gone very deep, and they write books, they give lectures, and they end up usually having a particular type of metaphysics that they communicate. Some classic examples of these would be people like John C. Lilly, Timothy Leary, Alan Watts, and people like that. And that's very valuable, but then it has like the side effect that you don't necessarily have critical feedback from epistemic peers, and you're kind of like liable to getting lost in your own world in a way. And then the other very common paradigm is kind of the standard academic approach to consciousness research, which is something along the lines of, hey, we select 50 people from the general population who have never tried psychedelics, and we give them their first mushroom experience in an fMRI, and ask them to fill out a questionnaire. And the problem with that is that these are not really like experts on the subject, and then the researchers themselves don't actually have like a direct experience of what they're like investigating. It does have the advantage that you have more critical feedback, and also you are less likely to kind of deceive yourself or like go crazy, because the researcher is not part of the loop in a way. But in our opinion, there's a lot of kind of psychological skills that this produces, or research outputs that ends up being like fairly shallow. Just to give you an example, in this sort of research, really as far as it goes when it comes to describing the visual effects of something like psychedelics, it's whether you experience like simple or complex geometry, but that's about it. Whereas we have like much more sophisticated kind of in-depth analysis of the state space of geometric effects of psychedelics. And so to contrast the individual explorer and the academic approach, we have this other paradigm we call the think tank kind of paradigm, where we have recruited just people who are like really, really top notch in their field, typically physics, maths, visual arts, and meditation. And then we have like regular meetings where we interview very deeply people with very deep experiences, and try to get to the bottom of it. And it's not only like, oh, did that feel good or bad, but it's like, what kind of harmonic scale did that have, or like what is the flicker frequency that you were experiencing, and iterating that way. So we think that's a potentially much more effective and efficient way of processing information about consciousness as a collective. So it's a very key kind of driving aesthetic of our research approach.
Amazing. Yeah, I really love that. Yeah, I've had the sense of like some of the people that I've listened to online in the deep meditation, psychonaut type space. Sometimes I start seeing this like worldview distort, or this kind of like narcissism, and like I've understood the nature of the universe kind of energy. And it's like, yeah, it just has me feeling like, yeah, just like dialoguing with people that could potentially like, in myself, I'm like, like, how do I find spaces where people can like check my own delusions and biases and deceptions when I'm like exploring different states of consciousness, and trying to communicate what they are, because they're obviously incredibly challenging things to communicate and help, yeah, with language.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. Like by default, I mean, researchers who are like very driven to kind of explore the frontiers of human knowledge oftentimes have very big egos. So it's very common for for kind of ego delusions to sneak in into the research, unfortunately.
Yeah, totally. Um, so yeah, I would love to dive into one of the things that I'm really interested in your work is tend to see this theme of like pleasure, of like of pleasurable states of consciousness. And I saw a couple of videos that you put out about how like there's kind of like this belief a lot of times in, and I definitely notice it in myself, where I'm like, suffering is good. It keeps me motivated to like do things. And you were poking holes in that a bit and being like, why is so like, why do we need suffering to motivate action? And can we like actually just cultivate more positive, pleasurable states of being and still like fully be agentic in the world in every way that we need to. And so I'm very, but then in a lot of the articles you've written too, I've just noticed this like both embodying more pleasurable states, but also mapping them and understanding them. And I'm curious, yeah, well, just if you could speak a bit about that theme in your work and like why is that such a why do you feel that that is such like a central part that if I were to guess, I'm imagining that it's like informing a lot of the different aspects of the work is what it feels like when I'm reading it.
Yeah, definitely. I guess yeah, as a high level concept, I put a lot of stock on yeah, kind of the philosophy of hedonism as really tapping into something very real. Um, it is very common to hear people say something like, "Well, I don't care about happiness; I care about meaning," or something like that. Whereas, yeah, I would argue that the reason meaning matters is because it feels good, or like it has like some elements about like the well-being. Like you want to be in the place where you're at, and that is essentially a hedonic quality of the experience. Um, it is often said by people that suffering generates a lot of meaning and it's necessary for meaning making, but I really haven't seen any evidence of that, to to be honest. um, Usually what I see instead is rationalizations. Why? Because if you've suffered a lot, then on top of that, being told that your suffering was for nothing is something that makes you suffer even more. Meaning, but here's the thing, like you're not even escaping the fact that you're motivated to avoid suffering. Here is just yeah, kind of this convoluted way of doing so by yeah, kind of like having a incorrect representation of what actually went on. I mean, from an evolutionary standpoint, the two primary uses of unpleasant states of consciousness are, first of all, to paralyze, to essentially, how does evolution get you to not move, to just like be quiet, essentially, either whether it is like panic or whether it is just intense pain, just kind of like just to not move. Evolution figured out, yeah, hey, like yeah, intense pain, intense depressions can do that. And then the other very big role that suffering plays from an evolutionary standpoint is to rush your decisions. And yes, there are some contexts where you could say that, well, there's a fire, you have to make a decision right now. There's a big disaster, you have to act right now. And from that point of view, yes, you could say that negative states of consciousness could be quite adaptive. But ideally, if we actually have the capacity to continue to move forward, interact with the world, there isn't kind of like a deep danger out there. And on top of that, we have the time to make our decisions properly, then I really don't see why, adding a depression on top of your decision-making process, like it really is going to help in any way, or like adding intense anxiety is really going to help in any way. There's like a little caveat here, which is that being acquainted with suffering does allow you to empathize a little bit better with other people who also have suffered. However, if you think about it, the reason why that matters is because then you can help them better, right? So in a hypothetical future where there's actually just no more suffering at all, there really wouldn't be a reason to reintroduce it. Like it just kind of a status quo bias, I would argue. So yeah, from that perspective, Qualia Research Institute and myself were very pleasure positive. It's like, no, actually pleasure is good. The thing that makes life meaningful ultimately cashes out in positive hedonic states of consciousness. The key question is, how do you avoid the common side effects or the common kind of pitfalls that come with pursuing pleasure? I mean, and there's a good number of them. I mean, such as addiction is an important one. Another one is kind of like biased reasoning, like motivated reasoning. If if there's something at stake, like I don't know, like a Las Vegas trip, and you really enjoy going to Las Vegas, like it's going to affect your reasoning. Things that will get in the way will probably seem like less appealing, even if they actually really matter. Um, but then also, at the far extreme of things to avoid is turning into something maybe we can get deeper later, which is becoming a pure replicator, which is where let's say you only care about yourself, and you don't necessarily care about the life of others or the well-being of others. That said, for me, none of this is really a death sentence for the idea that the thing that makes life worth living is pleasure. Rather, it is just things to work around. I'll leave it there for now. Yeah. Wait, your audio disappeared?
Oh yeah, there we go. There. My bad.
Oh yeah, there you go.
Yeah, it's so interesting to me that we could just increase the capacity for pleasure and like do that in a completely ethical way, and or like be aware of the potential pitfalls of that, and just increase our capacity to be in those states more often. One of the videos I really liked was you were talking about meta like loving kindness, and kind of how it's like a balloon, and you kind of just like get washed on like the jet stream of the positive feeling, so to speak, and just kind of like let it take you rather than like forcing it. And I found that really helpful in my own practice of like, can I like do this loving kindness meditation and then like notice what the good feeling is and kind of just like let it grow without forcing it to grow or something. It was like quite an interesting experience.
Yeah, no, I mean, loving kindness is an excellent example of where I find a lot of alignment on many levels, because loving kindness is like friendliness, well-wishing, seeing the best in others, and hoping that they don't suffer. It's very pro-social. Like, it's an emotion that I think, all else being equal, it's just better to have more of in pretty much every context. Um, and on top of that, it is something that does grow over time. It is something that it's not like addictive. It's not like heroin. It's not you you don't see meta junkies. People. It's kind of like just intensely craving to get out of work just to get their hit of loving kindness or something like that. It just doesn't work that way. But then also from like an analytic perspective, or like like it's a good topic to kind of exemplify the research aesthetic of the Qualia Research Institute, because most people, if they were to analyze loving kindness, most academics, even meditators, they would actually focus on the semantic content, such as like, hey, yeah, focus on imagining that there's a very happy golden retriever, for example. That's a very effective instruction for me personally. Like, it sparks like that friendliness, feeling of happiness. Or like, imagine like you're giving a hug to your mom or something like that. Like, all of those are kind of instructions, and you could have the temptation to believe that, well, loving kindness is fundamentally something about the well-wishing towards others, whereas actually I would make the case that that's a recipe for that state of consciousness, is a way to induce it, but that if you, instead, what you try to analyze is the texture of the experience, the way in which the experience actually presents itself, loving kindness does have a good number of interesting characteristics that sets it apart from other pleasurable states and other meditation states. And it has a lot to do with the um, type of attention and how it modifies attention. So um, one way to see loving kindness is that the objects that you hold in your attention, the way in which you probe them is with very soft wave envelopes. So there's this concept in signal processing in music theory as well that is called the attack, decay, sustain, release envelope of a note. Is one of the things that distinguishes between musical instruments. And, roughly speaking, this has to do with just how quickly the volume of the note increases and then how quickly it decays. So notes with what we would call a high attack are notes that they rise in volume very quickly. So kind of like a very sharp kind of like punch in a way. And then like let's say like nodes with very low attack are those that kind of like rise very slowly. You could imagine kind of like a very gentle flute, very slowly rising in volume. And as far as I can tell, quintessential to loving kindness is training your attention so that when you hold an object in your attention, the way you probe it with your attention is with these like soft and subtle kind of like rise of energy, as opposed to, let's say, like a very clean, fast, analytical type of thinking, which would be like very fast attack. It's kind of like kind of like chopping things up into lots of different pieces and like perceiving each of them one at a time. Loving kindness is kind of the complete opposite. It's almost kind of like you're perceiving things in this very slow, kind of gentle way that ends up blending a lot of the features. And it is that blended quality with soft edges, which is a thing that feels good about that state. And from our point of view, that is explained because that is a softening of experience that is increasing the symmetry and the smoothness of the experience. And in our model, that is fundamentally what pleasure ultimately comes down to.
Fascinating. Yeah, so I guess that would be another thing we could go into. I'm very intrigued by a lot of your work and how it's in a lot of the work of Qualia Research, and how like the symmetry of the experience is directly associated with the pleasure of the experience. And so it definitely in like different psychedelic states or different meditative states, I've definitely noticed that. But I'm curious, like, is there um how do you like define like symmetry of an experience? Like what is it like the phenomenological like texture of it? It just like feels not fragmented and not like at war with itself? Or like I'm curious if you can like help me understand like what a symmetrical experience is, or like how to pinpoint
Yeah.
it if it's happening in my experience.
Yeah. So, credit where credit is due. The symmetry theory of valence, the first time it was formulated was by Michael Johnson, one of the co-founders of QRI, in a book that is called Principia Qualia, written in 2015. I highly recommend reading it. It's really excellent. It's worth pointing out, though, that it was, back then it still was kind of like very high level and theoretical, without like really kind of examples to ground it, or like any concrete mathematics for like, okay, how do you quantify this? But something that Mike very much did was to kind of bring together, these different lenses for why symmetry matters so much. I mean, symmetry is like such a deep topic. Like some physicists even argue that when it comes down to it, like physics is ultimately the study of symmetry. There's this very, very important theorem called Noether's theorem that essentially states that there is a correspondence between preserved quantities in physics and symmetries, such as like the fact that like the laws of physics don't change over time. That is symmetry over time. Or that the laws of physics are the same everywhere in space. That is a symmetry over space. And each of these like entail a preserved quantity, such as preserved momentum, preserved charge, preserved angular momentum. And also, like, another important paradigm here is geometry through the lens of Felix Klein. Klein, the mathematician who came up with the Klein bottle, like very, very famous. He really kind of revolutionized how we think about geometry in math, where he realized that he could define a geometric space, let's say a 3D Euclidean space, or a 2D hyperbolic space, or a sphere, the surface of a sphere, in terms of what are the transformations you can apply to it that will leave it the same. So, for example, in a plane, like a infinite plane, a sheet of paper, so to speak, that has a couple of symmetries, such as rotational symmetry. Like if you take that plane and you just rotate it, it looks exactly the same. but also translation. You can take the plane and push it upwards in one direction, it will look exactly the same, and mirroring as well. And it turns out that like those transformations fully capture the geometry of the space. In other words, whether I tell you, oh, I'm talking about a plane, or I'm talking about something that remains the same under such and such transformation, it uniquely identifies the same thing, which is like that particular geometric space. And these kind of like very deep connections come to bear in consciousness. So when I'll say one more thing and then I'll connect the thing. So another thing is like, if you talk to like yoga instructors, they will say, yeah, you can kind of like roughly estimate how bad you feel based on how many energetic blockages you have on a given point in time. It's a total hippie speech, something that like 10 years ago I would have not paid attention in the least. It's like, what do you mean like energetic blockages? Like that just doesn't seem scientific at all. But phenomenologically, it's just very true. Like whenever you're in a state of craving, for example, you will notice that there's patterns of stress and tension in your body, or like more concretely your energy body, which is a phenomenological construct. Or physical pain. You can sort of like get a sense of like how bad physical pain is in terms of, hey, if you try to spread your attention as if it was a wave, where does it bounce off? Or like where does it get diffracted or refracted or distorted? So, and all of those blockages, they come down to actually being violations of symmetry. They are places in your field of experience where the transformations that used to keep everything the same don't keep everything the same anymore. So I'm just now quickly going to connect all of these pieces, which is that if you think of like what a very pleasant, beautiful state of consciousness usually is one where you're very energized, there's very few blockages, and where waves can travel without distortions, without disruptions, diffractions, refractions, without any of those kinds of effects. And that really connects with these deep models of physics, because when you have, let's say, a symmetrical field, meaning that it doesn't have these symmetry breaking operations, these blockages, it will mean, because of Noether's theorem, that there will be preserved quantities. In particular, on any very blissful state of consciousness, what you will find is that the energy that you put into it will continue to move around from one form to another. In other words, if you send a wave of attention down your spine, for example, it's going to travel without resistance. And that literally is in this model because there is a transformation you can apply to it that leaves it the same. And as a consequence, there's a preserved quantity, in this case, preserved amount of energy. Whereas an unpleasant state of consciousness that does have these blockages and disruptions, where the waves hit those blockages, you're gonna have like some energy loss or some strange things like energy spikes or irregularities. And we claim that that is the fundamental nature of suffering. Is whenever those invariants or conserved quantities get violated.
Fascinating. Yeah, I've never thought about symmetry as like lack of energy loss or ability of energy to move through a system without hitting some obstacle. But it feels very much like I think I was like, when I think of symmetry, it's always like this geometric, like visual almost of like a symmetrical geometric object or something. But to think about it in like the experiential like space of energy in my body, I can also like now picture that really well. But it's like quite different.
Yeah, no, I mean the first way in which you were thinking about it, it is, I would say, like a special case. It's kind of because I mean it is true that like a more mirror symmetric state of consciousness, like okay, literally left and right, or let's say in a beautiful art piece of art, um, if left and right are the same, that does mean that there is a transformation, which is like when you mirror the experience, that leaves it
Mhm.
the same. And if you introspect on like what is going on in your experience and why it feels good, you will notice that partly is because you can have this resonance between left and right, like this very quick flickering, and
Mhm.
it's a very smooth type of flickering. Whereas when the shapes are asymmetric, you can't do that, and so there is energy loss when you move the energy back and forth between left and right. Um, an important point to bring up here, right, is that people will say like, hey, but what if I actually do like asymmetry, right? Like a lot of like the most beautiful pieces of art have like various imperfections, like, or I don't know, think of the violinist crab, right? Like it's bilaterally asymmetrical, but it can look very artistic or look very, I don't know, deep or profound or something like that. Um, and to dive deeper into that, it's a whole topic, but it touches on Kiorai's theory of art, because there's other things to take into account as well for like what makes something good art. Um, and an important element is that symmetry breaking elements can actually be surprising, and then surprises, essentially prediction errors when you were expecting something and that expectation is violated, those generate energy spikes. So whenever there's something in art that you were not expecting, that will be a spike in energy and saliency. Now, in some contexts, that can give rise to an even more beautiful experience, because that spike of energy can then like energize all your state of consciousness. And if there's many other good elements, then those get boosted as well. Um, but it's definitely not going to be universal. I mean, like the most clear example here is that if in the middle of a, I don't know, Beethoven symphony, they they what is the name for this? Like industrial machinery, kind of like really dissonant, harsh, metallic sounds all of a sudden. That would be like extremely asymmetrical and extremely surprising, and in that context actually extremely unpleasant. So um, the surprise is kind of like a multiplier for the valence or for the quality
Mhm.
of the thing that is surprising. So it's kind of a whatever is surprising is something that you will end up experiencing more intensely that way. But then artists who know what they're doing can use little surprises in order to kind of like manage your energy and kind of create these spikes of energy and shape your experience in a way that ends up being net positive. So all of that is to say that the fact that there's counterexamples to symmetry being beautiful, um, to me it doesn't really it's not really an argument against the symmetry theory of valence. It's just that it's a little bit more complex. That you also have to take into account like energy management, energy cycles, and things like that.
Fascinating. Yeah, I'm imagining like a Beethoven song now, and like a symmetrical chord progression, and then like one note, like a piano note that's like different, would be much different than like a machinery sound or something. Like it's almost like staying with the same type of sound, but just surprising in what the actual note was or something.
That's right. That's right. That's right. Yeah, and I mean, when it comes to like art and tastes, like there's this a whole lot of reasons why people either like things or claim to like things. I mean, the most stark counterexample, if any, for the symmetry theory of valence would be noise music. In particular, there's like some especially highly unpleasant noise music. One artist I recommend just checking out to know what I'm talking about. It's Merzbow. He's a Japanese noise artist. Do you know what I'm talking about?
No, never heard of him.
Yeah, so like when somebody says like, "Oh, I like all types of music," right? Like sometimes people say that. It's like well, just give them a couple Merzbow songs, and they will say, "Okay, probably not all types of." But the point is that yeah, he is a Japanese artist who is actually a Jain, and he wakes up at 5 a.m. every morning and meditates for an hour, and then he just like spends like 16 hours the entire day just making the most horrible sounds possible he can think of.
Oh,
And then in his concerts, he plays them at 130 decibels. So just like, I mean, it's an extremely unpleasant experience, but there is a niche audience. And as far as I can tell, there's two core reasons why people actually listen to this music. I mean, one is um, because it signals just how tough you are. That is like one element. I mean, people signal their fitness by showcasing how much abuse they can endure, essentially, like the mosh pit, for example, at a concert, and things like that has a lot to do with that, and it's quite ego driven when it comes down to it. But then the other element is has to do with annealing, which I'm happy to dive deeper into. But this is the idea that if you're like heavily traumatized, or like you're in a particularly bad attractor in mind space, um, some like very unpredictable, extremely harsh inputs can like jitter you out of that attractor. And so in
mm,
in some ways, I think of kind of like some of these like very hardcore types of like very unpleasant art as almost kind of like chemotherapy for people who are like actually like they have so much internal dissonance that even this is an improvement upon what they're like experiencing by default.
mm,
That said, I still think they're listening to it when it comes down to it because it's doing something to their valence that is positive. I do not know of anybody who actually like likes intense pain or likes intense suffering. Like if anything, when people seem to like intense suffering, that is usually to distract themselves from something even worse.
mm. Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, it reminds me a lot of your article on the femoral, I think is how you say it, where I think one of the things you were pointing out in that was like, why would someone go through this much work in this much, coordination and logistical uh nightmare to make this thing happen? And I remember you saying something like it signals physical fitness because or like sexual fitness because it's like I have extra energy to expend on this, which means that I like am in my prime. Like it's like showing like that the abundance of extra energy to be in cognitive power to be used towards something that it does not have an entirely clear like a utilitarian purpose or something like that. But then also, I'm very curious. You wrote in that like the valence experience of that 7 day yeah of the well, as you call it a festival or I'm not sure what you would
Yeah,
call it.
festival. Yeah.
Um, but yeah, and just like how it's interesting to me. You talk about that and like Burning Man is like broken so far out of like normal culture in life that you're like maybe um primed to like experience a different quality of experience or like experience awe or mystery or wonder or some it's almost like you're so far out of the normal that it's like anything is possible at that point and you're just like more receptive to other potential states.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. So this is in the context of worldview and annealing. Yes, which is I mean, I don't know. Have you been at one of these festivals? Uh,
I have not, no.
okay. I mean, I do recommend like at least once. Like going to Burning Man once is very well worth doing. I'm not convinced that going multiple times is really the cost benefit is like all that good, mostly because um, it is pretty unhealthy, especially when you're factoring like the the, the dust and the sleep deprivation and all the stress that comes with it. Uh, but it does do something to the human soul that I think is very beneficial, and it works more or less as follows because um, it is kind of this counterexample to the idea that everybody is out out to either get you or out, just to further their own selfish desires. Because here you have like a, one of these contexts is where everywhere you go, people are like giving you gifts or like, gifting their time and energy, and social capital, with really no expectation in return, and it's just so heartwarming. And then the art tends to be really original and surprising. So like when you spend like several days at a festival like that, day after day, your whole nervous system is getting flooded with prediction errors. It's like, yeah, you're not expecting this, and you're not expecting this, and keeps going and keeps going, and each of those prediction errors is an energy spike, and that builds up. So like even if you're not taking any drugs, just by the fourth day or something, you're you're definitely in an altered state, and in that, yeah, heightened energy state of consciousness, where a lot of your preconceptions have been challenged, it is a context where you can revisit kind of like deep-seated priors or prejudices about society, about what humans are and what we're capable of.
Mhm.
That just provides a counterexample to like, no, actually we, if resources weren't that big of an issue, and we had like a good culture, we really could turn this planet into a paradise, like but actually.
Amazing. Yeah, definitely. It's definitely on my list to attend in the near future. I was trying to go this year or last year, and didn't happen, but definitely gonna make it out there at some point. Yeah, that being said, I would love to hear yeah, how would you like describe worldview and kneeling? Because like some of the it's I've read it in a couple of your articles and still having trouble like rocking what it actually is or like the relevance of it. And so I'm very curious to hear like in the context of what we've been talking about, like how would you describe worldview and kneeling?
Yeah, so for background, like annealing is a is a I guess like operation that you can do in metallurgy. That is like the original context. So if you take a cliffhanger, is that what it's called? Yeah, cliffhanger. No, um, a hanger. Yeah, sorry, a hanger where you hang out on your clothes, right? Like this metallic hang. If you bend it a bunch of times, the metal becomes brittle, right? And then it's kind of like easy to break apart, even without like specialized tools, right? So if you look at like what's happening at the atomic scale to the metal when you're like bending it over and over, is that you're adding lots of tiny imperfections and stress faults in the lattice structure of the metal. In other words, like the atoms stop being symmetrically aligned, and they become there's like fault lines essentially in the crystal lattice. But then if you take one of these hangers that is in this like very brittle state, and then you heat it over in fire, and then you let it cool down slowly, you're gonna notice that it's not brittle anymore. So
Mhm.
heat itself did something kind of magical to it. Um, and really, what's going on there is this process where the heat actually disorders the crystal lattice even more, but then the slow process of cool down um, allows the atoms to essentially reorganize into a symmetrical lattice again. So it's
Mm.
one of these very puzzling, interesting cases where you get order via adding disorder first. Uh, it's you first kind of like break apart the internal stress patterns, and then you can actually achieve like a much more symmetrical configuration. So likewise, we've speculated for many years at Qualia Research that um, we essentially develop kind of like this internal stress over time by using our nervous system. And we get something similar to that, like our nervous system becomes brittle as we overwork it. Um, and more so, we accumulate prediction errors. I mean, there's like things that we just can't explain with the models that we have, things that are surprising. And those surprises kind of like linger. I mean, the nervous system knows that, well, your model didn't account for that, and that prediction error is slightly unpleasant, slightly asymmetrical. And if you go on for years without like really updating your models, you just have kind of like a backlog. It's kind of technical debt on your nervous system, essentially. Now, the similar to kind of in metallurgy, we have like this concept of like a temperature parameter, but for your nervous system. To a first approximation, it might be something like, how many spikes of neurons per second does the neural tissue have? That would be like the most brute force type of approximation. I think there's like better ways of quantifying like the temperature parameter, but the point is that when you energize the nervous system, not in the sense of like physical temperature, but in the sense of the temperature parameter of the network, it allows for much faster and efficient internal communication. In other words, the prediction errors, rather than getting stuck into the particular context where they arose, they can cross-pollinate. There's a crosstalk between the different neural modules that made different predictions. And this catalyzes a search process where all of a sudden you have kind of a loaded up all of these prediction errors that your models previously had not been able to predict. And you have this dedicated period where you're just exploring combinations very quickly. And in that way, you're much more likely essentially to arrive at a new model or like a new compression of all of that data sensor input that can retroactively make sense of all of the things that you weren't able to make sense of before. So, and importantly, then you also need a cool down period. You also need it's not only about like getting up there, but also how do you cool down slowly so that the new models actually stick? Because there is this is very relevant for like, let's say, psychedelic experiences, but because if you take the metal in a melted state, in a heated state, and rather than letting it cool slowly, what you do is you just like put in a bucket of water all of a sudden, or like in an ice bath, that actually makes it a lot worse, because that's gonna make lots of tiny crystals and become extra brittle, and it's gonna be worse than how you started. So interrupting the annealing process also could actually make things worse. You could kind of like crystallize, like rather than the new models, you would be crystallizing the confused state that you're in, which is, I think, quite relevant for even, for example, like managing like challenging experiences or bad trips, broadly speaking, that just being given an antipsychotic all of a sudden may in some sense be a way of like crystallizing that confused state, and like maybe might reduce the unpleasantness in the moment, but then you actually will have kind of that lingering brittle state for much longer. So it's presumably advisable to figure out how to write it out to as best as possible, and let it cool down more organically.
Mm-hmm. That's really fascinating. Yeah, I've noticed in my own experience, after having my worldview shattered a couple times, it took like, I'm curious like what the time scale is it of that cooling process is too, because like in my experience I found like sometimes it was like a month, sometimes it was like even like a year of like I felt like my worldview like slowly orienting towards something else. And like obviously like a peak experience, it'll be like within like 12 to 24 hours it'll be back to like fully not like altered, but it feels like sometimes the ramifications of that worldview like shattering experience can like play out over like weeks and months or even years.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I probably would talk about that extended period, maybe with something slightly different. Maybe it's kind of managing the afterglow or something like that. But I think cooling, I would probably cap it off at maybe 48 hours or something like that. Depends on the substance. I mean, some of the deepest annealing substances like ibogaine, uh, the cool down period will be several days at least,
Mhm.
quite literally. Um, Whereas, yeah, like other things, let's say like NNDMT, the cooldown period really would be just like more like 20 minutes to half an hour. But what you're talking about is also very meaningful, which is, yeah, when you keep encountering kind of the delta or the difference between your updated models and how you used to think before, because you're encountering it's kind of encountering yourself again in all of these different contexts that
Right, right.
um, yeah, I'll have to come up with a term or concept handle for like that extra additional. I don't know. Some recent kind of research papers talk about, yeah, the reopening the critical learning window, and like maybe that would be the way to talk about it.
Mhm. Awesome. Yeah, there's something I think we could go into here, which seems to relate a bit. A couple things actually. One is, yeah, I guess we'll start with this one. In one of your articles, I think it was called. Let's see. Um, I think it was called "Evolution of the Phenomenal Self."
Mhm.
It might have been the one on David Pierce in the long-term future of consciousness. It was one of those. But you talk about how like um it's kind of what you were talking about at the beginning of the episode, like someone who's like trying to research altered states of consciousness, like perhaps like psilocybin studies or something, without having actually experienced it themselves, is going to be like a very like kind of dry, not nuanced approach. But then I think you also go to the other end, and like someone who's like a pure psychonaut may be so cognitively overwhelmed that they also can't like quite grasp what is going on, because there's just like, and that feels to me a little bit like this worldview and kneeling thing. Like if you just keep like going through the process, it might be hard for it to like solidify into something that actually helps you make sense of reality, and like feel a sense of meaning.
Yes, that's right. I mean, I think the failure mode of, let's say, yeah, John Lilly. Yeah, he's the researcher who invented the sensory deprivation tanks and did a bunch of work with interspecies communication with dolphins. And it's a good example because I mean I really love his work, and I have, as you know, a tender heart for him because I really like his books, and the fact that he really cared about like figuring out the nature of reality went all the way. But it's quite clear that he was, yeah, overfeeding on a particular model of reality that made him delusional at the end of the day. Uh, he ended up writing about something he called ECHO, which is the Earth Coincidence Control Office, where he believed that there were, yeah, these entities that are managing the coincidences and synchronicities in everyday life. There's going to be a big battle in the future between uh, biological life and synthetic life, but not only theoretically, but also he was thinking that, from the future they were like beaming information back, and there's, a bunch of things that are like clearly delusional thinking.
Uh-huh.
And in his case, I would say, like, yeah, he was overdoing the annealing and not letting yeah, things cool down properly, or really be able to receive critical feedback from epistemic peers. Yeah, he was lost in his own world, and that is a big failure mode to be very aware of.
Hmm.
Also in
Yeah.
meditation, like meditation is also common. Sorry, like it's not only psychedelics, but I know people who quote unquote have gone kind of off the rails in meditation for similar reasons.
Huh. Yeah, that's really interesting. Um, Yeah, I've heard Daniel Ingram talk about this a lot in terms of like jhana junkies, where like they'll just get like a pleasurable jhanic state, and then like, oh, this is awakening. I guess I can just stay here forever. Um,
Well, I, yeah, I don't know. Like, I'm not sure if I would agree with Daniel on even the existence of Janna Junkins. I mean, then again, he certainly knows many more meditators than I do and has been in the space for longer. But uh, I haven't really encountered anybody for whom like I could say like jhanas are really an issue. Typically, if anything, it's sort of like something that actually gives you this deep sense of reassurance that you don't need an external source of pleasure. You can just get it endogenously.
Mhm.
And if anything, that makes you more calm and less impulsive. Also, Rob Orbia, who's another amazing teacher I recommend, who wrote a book called Seeing That Freeze, one of my favorite books of all time. He yeah, is also very skeptical that there is anybody who is actually ever has had a kind of like a jhana problem, you know, who needs a jhana intervention or
Mhm.
something. But then again, Daniel knows more people in that space, so maybe he's right.
Yeah, I just bought Verbea's book. I'm gonna dive into it in the next month or so here.
Oh,
Um,
fantastic! I mean, about Robert Bia that I so much of his approach is actually driven by using your feeling as your guide, like even insight practice, right? Like for a lot of the Daniel Ingram style insight practice is very much kind of like an investment. Is something like, well, it's going to be very unpleasant, it's going to be very gritty and rough, but the payoff is great in the future, or something like that. um, but Rob Rubia instead, actually he says like the way he teaches insight practice, and for those who don't know, insight practice is that makes you quote unquote realize the three characteristics of existence, which is impermanence, no self, and dissatisfaction. Um, because they usually sound like a bummer. It sounds like, oh man, like I don't want that to be true, right? Like humans don't like those concepts for the most part. We want to have a self. We want things to be satisfying. We want things to be forever. Like that's just who we are as a species. But Rob Orbia, he flips it around, and actually he says like, no, the technique that he recommends is to sensitize yourself to the sense of well-being and sense of ease in the body, and just notice how when you have something uncomfortable or some issue in life, if you repeat over and over a phrase such as like, well, it will pass, it will pass, it's impermanent, it's impermanent, if that causes a positive feeling, that is a good direction. In other words, let your feeling be your guide. And based on my experiences at least, and his students, he would argue that actually sidesteps a lot of like unpleasant stages of insight issues, that like the dark night of the soul is just not much of an issue if all throughout you have used positive feeling as your guide. So that's
mhm.
that's why, yeah, I really really love him as a teacher.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, Ingram does kind of it gives me the feeling of like you gotta go through the dark night sooner or later. Might
Yes,
as
yes.
well confront my terrors.
Yes,
um,
he's I don't know, it's like it is kind of like the aesthetic of like a power lifter, or like I don't know, like cold plunges type aesthetic, which I mean, I think it's a important thing to have in the toolkit, but you should know that there's like other options too.
uh-huh. Yeah, it reminds me of like Frank Yang. He very much fits that archetype.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
um, awesome. Yeah. So I think one thing we could go into before I'll probably wrap it up in at 30.
Mhm.
So about a little over 15. So we can just do maybe touch one more topic. Yeah, so I just think this like pleasure, pain, suffering kind of topic, it just seems to just be lighting me up as we're talking. And I'm very curious, like, all right, so this article where you talk about the sailboat metaphor of like using negative experiences to like actually like frame them in a way that causes you to move towards more positive feelings or something.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you could like describe that because it how yeah, if you're feeling like a really deeply asymmetrical, painful, suffering state, what are some tools you found to like relate or work with that? in a way that doesn't like artificially perpetuate it.
Yeah. I should clarify. Yeah, that's it's a quantum computing article. I didn't write these. These were like letters from Anders and Maggie, who are a couple in Sweden who are like
Okay.
very QRI involved. Um, uh, and one of the topics that are talked about there is the idea of like tacking on the winds of valence, which is, you know, how like in a sailboat, it's very mind-blowing that like you can actually, you know, move in the same direction from which the wind is coming, right? Which, you know, sounds very counterintuitive. Like, you know, as a kid, is like, no, that's impossible. It's obviously impossible to do something like that. But no, it's just a matter of technique and being able to orient the sail properly and orient the boat properly so that the forces add up actually in a way that, yeah, you get like a net positive force in the direction of the direction towards the wind, where the wind is blowing. And in the context of this is like, okay, like if when the going gets tough and you're working on a project and, you know, you're really tired and it's unpleasant and distractible, and how do you keep going? Well, I mean, first of all, I will mention that, you know, burnout is a very real thing and it's very important to avoid. So like if you notice, yeah, signs of burnout, it usually will pay off to take it easy and take breaks and not push yourself too hard. But the truth too is like sometimes you really don't have like an option, right? Like if it is like your whole career is at stake, or your whole, I don't know, your whole health is at stake, or your whole marriage is at stake, or something like that, and you really have to push through. Sometimes you just have to push through. And in that context, probably the most powerful technique or lens I could suggest is really investing more in equanimity. I mean, the thing is like equanimity, I think, is oftentimes very poorly understood. Equanimity is typically thought of as indifference towards pleasure and pain. It's kind of like, well, I don't care about pleasure and pain. I care something like I care about meaning or something like that. It's kind of a typical framing. However, especially from the teachings of Shinzen Young, who wrote The Science of Enlightenment, which I highly recommend. For him, equanimity, it's a very deep physical phenomenon that happens, where is the reciprocal of how much you're resisting. In particular, he has this equation, which is trying to get at what suffering is, which he equates as like suffering equals pain times resistance, or would be also describable as suffering equals pain times 1 over equanimity, or like, yeah, the reciprocal of equanimity. And this is the idea that, you know, pain only actually kind of like becomes impactful or really troublesome when you're making it go through a layer of physiological and psychological resistance, which kind of like overheats the organism, and that is really at the deeper level kind of like what makes the experience unpleasant. And based on his own observations on, you know, high-end meditation, you could actually endure enormous amounts of pain if you're experiencing them with complete equanimity. The amount of suffering is going to be close to zero, because, you know, almost any number multiplied by 0 is equals to 0. If resistance is 0, you know, you're going to get very close to zero suffering. Now, it's very important actually here to not kind of like fall for the trap of moralizing this. I mean, one failure mode is to thinking of kind of like the absence of equanimity as a moral failure, in which case it's something like, well, if you're suffering, it just means that you lack equanimity, and, you know, you're bad for that reason, right? And it's the main problem here is like how we might approach people with chronic pain. You know, we may think like, well, you know, they deserve it because they don't have equanimity. Would be one particularly bad failure mode of this lens. But the truth, though, is that equanimity, it's a process that requires kind of like propagating this absence of resistance to subconscious programmings, and it's not something that happens overnight. So approaching an experience with the aim of I'm not going to resist it, I'm not going to resist it, I'm going to relax all my muscles and let it happen. For example, taking a cold shower or eating very hot peppers. Those are very good practice runs, for example, of like something that's negatively valenced, but if you experience with equanimity, it's almost no problem. You will notice that it's something you have to build towards. Like when you start out like eating hot peppers, at first, you may, from a top-down perspective, say like, okay, I'm not going to resist it, but some deeper programs within you will still be resisting it. So what you will have to do is like over the course of days, up to like a month or longer, it's almost kind of like that programming of I'm gonna just let it happen and observe it without judging, just experience it. It starts to trickle down, and eventually, when it starts to really trickle down, then equanimity becomes automatic. Like it's a case where like you don't even need to consciously think like, well, I'm not gonna resist it because it just happens on its own. And he also equates equanimity to kind of essentially the opposite of viscosity would be a way of also a way of putting it. That extremely high equanimity states of consciousness are states of consciousness where the energy moves around in a completely fluid way with zero viscosity, almost kind of superfluid helium or one of these strange physics experiments where viscosity is goes down to zero. And phenomenologically, I think there's something very related to that. And for me, perhaps like the most powerful example of this phenomenon is the range of experiences that can happen on 5-MeO DMT, because it is one type of experience that really bifurcates into two kind of like possible attractors, which is like 5-MeO often will either be, the most blissful, amazing experience of your life or the worst experience of your life. And it all has to do with like how much unconscious resistance there is to the effects of the substance. Where like, if you have like a really positive 5-MeO experience, it essentially feels like you have like zero viscosity in your field of consciousness and things just flow with zero resistance. Whereas a very intensely unpleasant 5-MeO experience is kind of like fractal resistance. It's like you're resisting it on your muscles and your blood vessels and your nervous system, just like everywhere you're resisting, and it's just extremely unpleasant and traumatizing. So you got to be careful with that one.
Definitely. Yeah. So wait, so if suffering equals pain times resistance, then equanimity, where does equanimity fit into that
Oh
again?
equanimity is equal to 1 over resistance.
1 over resistance. Okay. Um, yeah, that's really fascinating. I can definitely resonate with the experience of like intending to let go of resistance, and then like there's just still being something that's resisting that I don't know where it is. It's just like completely unconscious resistance happening.
Yes.
Um,
Yes. No,
so
and there's layers to it. I mean, I would be, I'd say something like your capacity to let go in a given moment in time really only reaches kind of like 10% of what's there. And like the other 90% is something that you have to train over the course of weeks and months to let the equanimity trickle down.
yeah.
I mean, and that's just something, I mean, because oftentimes like almost people who trip a lot, they almost sometimes have kind of this judgmental attitude of like, well, if they had a bad trip, it just means they just couldn't let go, right? It's like, I mean, I bet you wouldn't be able to in the same circumstances, right? Like it's a matter of like, well, what was your subconscious state? And it's not something you can fix in the moment. You need a while to make it work.
Definitely. Yeah, I've definitely noticed that trend. It's like the more comfortable you are with the altered state, the more you can like notice the resistance you have to it. Whereas if it's like this completely novel altered state, it's just like, what is happening? Like it's just like this full body like contraction. Sometimes I've definitely experienced that before.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
especially if you try to go too deep too fast.
Yes.
Um,
Well, one thing I wanted to touch upon briefly that I really, I mean, what I really appreciated your interview with Daniel Ingram was kind of like his the lens that he applied on kind of like some of the sensations that you were describing. I mean, I don't know like where you're at and in that path, but you were describing something like an unpleasant kind of like chest sensation, and then like one of the key kind of um, yeah, instructions or like suggestions that he had was to notice how it only feels so big because you're focusing your attention on it. But like if you instead like spread your attention all throughout the field of experience, you realize like, hey, actually this is only like 5% of the experience. So this is only like 2%. And uh, I don't know. I thought like that interview was very endearing because I could tell like you were feeling a lot better throughout the interview through those suggestions. I don't
uh-huh.
know. It sounded like it was helpful.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I was sitting with that in the interview and after, and then yeah, there's something about like if I only focus on the fear, like I think what I was bringing up to was like the fear or the existential terror.
Yeah.
And it's like if I'm like in that, it becomes my whole reality and everything becomes terrifying. But if it's like that spacious awareness, attention on it, it's like, yeah, it's pretty uncomfortable in my chest, and the rest is pretty all right.
Yeah. Yep.
And it's almost like yeah, it's like a lot of Ingram's approach seems to be like the patterns of sensations. Like, what is the actual sensation pattern, or I guess phenomenological experience? Like, what is that actual? What is it independent of like all of this extra stuff that's added on to it that makes it so much more sticky?
Yep. Yeah, exactly.
Awesome. Yeah, I really appreciate you coming on the show today and talking about Qualia and the stuff that you're working on. I think that a lot of people will find this informative. I felt like we were able to touch on a lot of the different topics of your work in a way that like made it really easily digestible. I feel much more like when I see like Worldview and Kneeling or something like that, I'm like, oh, and I have a genuine sense of like, yeah, this makes sense now. And
Awesome.
I really appreciate you yeah, coming on and sharing about your work.
Yeah, no, thank you for digging into it and preparing for it. I had a great time.
Awesome. Would you want to direct listeners to anywhere they can find you on the web?
Yeah, sure. I mean, qualiacomputing.com is where I do my blogging. So the bar for for when I put out something, it's a lot lower there than in qri.org, which is the side of the organization, which, yeah, we reserve um, essentially, I think things that are like much more properly justified, properly, with proper citations and all of that for qri.org. But if you want to see kind of the more unfiltered, rough ideas, qualiacomputing.com. And my Twitter as well. I'm pretty active on Twitter. Just also a lot of like raw, unfiltered ideas because in practice it has been very valuable to actually share them that way. Um, and YouTube. We have a Qualia Research Institute YouTube channel and also have a personal YouTube channel, and we upload pretty regularly.
Awesome. Yeah, I will make sure to put all the links in the show notes in the
Beautiful.
description.
Awesome. Well,
Awesome.
thank you again, and yeah, Godspeed with your podcast, and may it be grand.
Thank you so much.